The Cold War was like nothing we'd ever seen before. It was a violent war, but without the violence. It had a very significant impact in history on how we fought wars in the future. The Cold War had started when we had just ended World War II. Well, it had a build up from since we ended World War II. Countries hadn't had time to focus on relations as much for those 10 years. So, Russia and the US were both very big superpowers building up atomic arsenals after World War II, which led to a massive amount of debate and not much diplomacy. And also, there happened to be a lot of um, conflicts, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I won't get very far into. The Cold War was not exceptionally violent, but it was still not necessarily a war that you want to mess with because it had a very stable balance, mutually assured destruction, but they keep trying to one up each other, both the US and Russia, but always try to one up each other. Okay. The Cold War had been caused by a multitude of things. One, their obvious similarities, the US and Russia's obvious similarities, leading to a clear cut conflict that they would just be guaranteed to have. And and the conflict was kind of thrust onto them by how much they or how similar they were in terms of what they uh, were striving for. The Cold War caused, as you can see here, a massive change in the stock market. It was a huge, uh, you see, later in the Cold War, you see very low stock prices, which equates to a slight stock market crash. Uh, and right after, so you can't see the numbers on there, but there are numbers at the bottom, and there are uh, there was a slight crash after there was a slight drop right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It also caused an arm race throughout, uh, during and after the Cold War. They were still, even now, the US, not really Russia anymore, but the US is still competing with other countries. For example, there was a huge arm race, and uh, yeah, you can see the Tsar bomb was created in the Cold War. So you see, the three large bombs were created in the Cold War, and then look at the ones that were created only about, like, what, 10 years before? You see the difference. The Cold War was very significant in history. We really have a lot to learn from. We know don't threaten each other with nukes if the other country has nukes. Don't threaten with nukes in general, uh, because it brings about mutually assured destruction, which is not something you exactly want when you're fighting a war. And and that we have very we have a lot to learn from. We can really see the effects in where the USSR ended and how the world has changed since then. I don't think there were any events that were very similar to the Cold War. We'll never get images like these that are with uh, that just show people building up a nuclear arsenal right next to where you are and hoping you don't notice, which is a very good thing. Um, yeah. All in all, the Cold War was a very singular, very one of a kind event that did not really, it wasn't really violent, but it also was at the same time. Hello, may you please introduce your credentials?
Yes, my name is Samuel Kaufman. I have 15 years experience in the intelligence world, 15 plus. I spent about 6 years in the United States Army as a human intelligence operative with multiple combat deployments. And I have a master's degree in global security with underpinning in intelligence from Arizona State.
How did the Cold War impact the Russian and US economies?
Well, economically speaking, the Cold War was a huge deal. The economic impact on both the U.S. and the Soviet Union was vast. The U.S. and Soviet Union both spent astronomical amounts on defense, national security. The result being eventually the U.S. was able to, through things like Star Wars, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative from the Reagan administration, able to outspend the Soviet Union and eventually bankrupt them.
How was the Cold War significant in history?
That's a great question. It is a singular event in the sense that it has not seen a rival in the national security, or should say the international relations and national security sphere. There has not been anything like it in terms of proxy war, which is major countries having smaller nations fight wars on their behalf. It is scope and size of it were unrivaled in history.
How did the Cold War impact international relations?
It the Cold War was, in some senses, almost like another world war in that so many smaller nations became involved. Some in the communist sphere, some in the Western sphere, the U.S., U.K., Germany, etc., West Germany, etc. Countries like Angola, countries like Vietnam, Brazil, all over the world. You saw some countries in the Soviet sphere and the U.S. sphere, and there were those proxy fights we talked about. Very unique.
How did the Cold War impact technology of war?
The technology aspect is actually something that we're still benefiting from today in the United States. We were forced, war and conflict are the mother of necessity, and we actually developed a lot of new weapons and weapon systems, and our national security improved a great deal because of it.
Well, I think that's enough information.